Oh, good morning, Protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite afternoon class, eighth period. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my lecture, of course, for it's Friday. Thank gosh, everybody. It's Friday, and it's February 18th, 2022. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So again, make certain in the top right-hand corner, a new clean sheet of paper. Make certain that you've dated your notes for today. It's an organizational strategy for success. Again, you have a blue or black pen, multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape. But again, I'm going to respectfully ask everybody from refraining from using your correctable tape and your highlighters during the Zoomcast, in that I really want you to focus and I want you to listen and I want you to take those really good copious notes. You guys are doing a wonderful job. Your note-taking skills have improved exponentially since the beginning of the school year. But now we have to take it to that next level of not just focusing on those main bullet points, but adding the additional information. All right, so our first topic heading, I want you to write this down: Calais or Normandy. And you're going to notice again at times that I'm going to be picking up the pace just a little bit because we have a lot of content that we need to cover today. But again, the beauty of the Zoomcast, and you've done a marvelous job of the way you've been able to pause the Zoomcast and allowing yourself a chance to get caught up with your note taking. All right, so let's trace our steps back for just a moment. I had just introduced the D-Day invasion with my last Zoomcast. So everybody knew, going back to June of 1940, it was only a matter of time. The Allies knew it, the Nazis knew it, Hitler knew it, that it was only a matter of time before the Allies would try to take back France from the Nazis. Now, the big question, of course, was where was the invasion going to come? So Hitler, again from his perspective, assumed that the Allies were going to try to cross the Strait of Dover right here. This is the narrowest point between the English Channel here and the North Sea here. And he just figured it was the easiest way for the Allies to make the crossing to get from Dover, England, over to Calais, France. In addition, remember, Operation Fortitude, which I taught you last time, is when the Brits and the Americans created this fake, phony phantom army led by George Patton of the American army to, again, try to fool Hitler in thinking that this fake army over here was the actual invasion force. And that was, again, the ruse that we tried to perpetuate. But in actuality, the Allied invasion, I should say, is going to hit down over here. See what I'm circling with my cursor? And over here, this is really the main force of the Allies at this point. And this is the area they're going to be hitting in France. We, of course, know this as Normandy. So again, with everything, a couple of keys: you've got to have the element of surprise with Operation Fortitude in convincing Hitler that the invasion was going to come from this narrow point through the Strait of Dover here, instead of crossing the main point of the English Channel here and hitting, of course, Normandy. You also have to have the weather has got to cooperate as well. Again, I should say future President Dwight David Eisenhower, now Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower, had his own contingency of meteorologists who were carefully studying and monitoring the weather. Originally, D-Day was supposed to be June 5th, pushed back a day because of the weather. June 6th became a goal. So what I'd like everybody to now do is I want you to take, I would say, about 3 minutes. And I'm going to ask everybody to write for me a one-paragraph reflection. I really need you to pause your Zoomcast now. This is a political cartoon that came out around the time of the D-Day invasion. And I want you in this paragraph, again, you're going to pause the Zoomcast to do two things. Number one, I want you to describe all the details of this political cartoon. And then number two, I want you to tell me in the last one or two sentences of this paragraph, this is a visual discovery, this is honing and developing those critical thinking skills. So what was the point that this political cartoon was trying to make, okay? I, of course, am going to continue on with the Zoomcast because I know you can pause it. All right, let's continue on. So what I want everybody to do is I'd like everybody to skip a full page. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. I want you to date your notes again for today It is February 18th. It's 2000 and of course 22. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie together some loose ends. I've given you some background information of the D-Day invasion. You know, we talked about Operation Fortitude, talked about, again, whether it was Calais or Normandy and how we tried to deceive Hitler into thinking where the invasion was going to be as compared to where it actually went. And so now this video clip does a really nice job of, again, tying together all the loose ends and telling the story. So I'm going to go through these guide questions relatively quickly. Please pause the Zoomcast whenever you need to. Here we go. Number one. So how many Allied soldiers were involved with the D-Day invasion of 1944, June 6th? And then part two of this guide question, who led the invasion of Normandy, France? Number two, what role did Dwight David Eisenhower play in the D-Day invasion? I already alluded to Eisenhower a little bit earlier. Well, I'll be coming back to Eisenhower when we get into the Cold War in March into early April. Next guy question, how many ships did the Allies have? What about the Germans? Again, I'm not going to necessarily ask you a statistical question per se, but stats are great support, and it could also be used as a context clues. It can be used as a clue and an answer choice. So that's why I always tell students and really emphasize it. If you hear a statistic, jot it down. How about some more stats? How about how many airplanes did the Allies have? What about the Germans? Which beach? Okay, there were multiple beaches, 5 total, with regards to the D-Day invasion. Which beach suffered the most casualties, statistically speaking? Remember how we had talked earlier about the Atlantic Wall, how Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Hitler's favorite general, had set up this again, a line of defense along the west coast of France, all the way up towards the Netherlands. Again, concrete barriers, pillboxes set up in the cliffs. Again, mines planted in the beaches. So again, it's going to be a huge undertaking for the Allies in order to be able to pull this off. Stats and more stats. Again, how many casualties did the Allies suffer? And what about the Germans? And when we talk about the Allies, certainly the Americans are going to play a huge role in the D-Day invasion, but the Brits are also going to play a huge role. Some French will play a role in the D-Day invasion, those who escaped the evacuation of Dunkirk 4 years earlier, which I talked about. And even the Canadians, our neighbors to the north, will also play a role in the D-Day invasion. And then finally, I think this video does a great job, again, of summarizing, again, the importance. What was the importance of the D-Day invasion? June 6th, 1944. Here we go.
D-Day was the largest seaborne invasion in world history and was a pivotal moment in World War II. On the morning of June 6th, 1944, nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and stormed 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of Normandy, France. The United States led the assault to try to retake the western coast of Europe from the Germans, who had conquered and been occupying it for 4 years. In the months and weeks leading up to the invasion, the Allies used a variety of means to deceive the Germans, who knew an attack was coming but didn't know where it would focus. After postponing the invasion by a day because of bad weather, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave the go-ahead for the operation, codenamed Neptune. Shortly after midnight, 24,000 British, US, and Canadian airborne troops parachuted into France. Around the same time, minesweepers began clearing channels for the invasion fleet, which was comprised of almost 7,000 boats of all types, although around 4,100 of these were landing crafts carrying infantrymen. The Germans, by contrast, had just over 100 total ships in the area at the time and were heavily outnumbered. The same was true for the German Air Force, which could muster only 815 aircraft over Normandy in comparison to the Allies' 9,500. Naval bombardment of the beaches commenced at 5:45 a.m. while it was still dark. Allied infantry and armored divisions began landing on the coast of France, starting at 0630. The men landed under heavy fire from gun encampments overlooking the beaches. The shore was mined and covered with wooden stakes, metal tripods, and barbed wire obstacles, making the work of the beach clearing teams difficult and dangerous. Casualties were heaviest at Omaha with its high cliffs. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, several towns were cleared in house-to-house fighting. The Allies did not achieve all of their goals on D-Day. Only Juno and Gold Beach were linked in the first 24 hours, and all 5 bridgeheads were not connected until nearly a week had passed. However, the operation was successful, as the Allies gained a precious foothold that gradually expanded as they drove into Germany from the west over the coming months. German casualties on D-Day were around 1,000 men. Allied casualties were at least 12,000, with 4,414 confirmed dead. With Russia bearing down from the east, the European side of World War II ended with the surrender of Germany less than a year after the Normandy operation. Once Japan surrendered in September 1945, the deadliest conflict in human history was over. It had taken the lives of anywhere from 50 to 85 million people. The outcome of the war has been critical in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the last 70 years. The victorious great powers, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, France, and what is now the Russian Federation, became the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Thanks for watching this historic episode of The Daily Conversation. I'm Bryce Plank.
Did a nice job. Again, a couple of takeaways. Number one, again, you look at the superiority that the Allies had in terms of ships, in terms of airplanes, in terms of manpower. But the one advantage that the Nazis had was their strategic positions, as they mentioned at Omaha Beach in particular, where, again, the Nazis were hiding up in the cliffs in the pillboxes, and it made the task so much more arduous and so much more challenging to be able to not only just land on Omaha Beach, which was the bloodiest of all the beaches of D-Day invasion, but then you have to make your way across the beach and then try to scale those cliffs as well. It truly was remarkable. It was the single biggest invasionary force in recorded history in terms of not just air power, but sea power, land power. And again, it's the turning point of when you look at the western part of Europe. If the Allies failed to take back France, the chances are they're never going to take it back, and Hitler would have scored a victory. And the whole timeline and the whole scope and sequence of history as we know it would be a very dramatic one. But thank goodness the Allies, through overcoming a lot of obstacles, were able to persevere. Huge, huge, huge turning point of World War II, as they pointed out. All right, let's continue on. So now, I'd like everybody to go back to those previous notes that you had started writing earlier. I want to finish up the D-Day invasion, and then we're going to segue into another big topic as we're wrapping up the European theater of World War II. So now it's a couple of months later. It's now August, and the year is 1944. And by August of 1944, once the Allies, through a lot of, again, sacrifices that were made, especially at Omaha Beach, that was the beach in particular that the Allies, the Americans, suffered some pretty heavy losses. But the bottom line is they now have infiltrated France, and over the next several months, were able to push the Nazis further and further away, so that by the time you get to August of 1944, 2 months later, Paris, France, the former capital of France itself, was liberated by the Allies. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, great photograph. This, of course, is Paris, France. These were, again, Nazis who had been occupying the city for several years, being paraded through the streets of Paris. It was a huge deal. Now, why is, again, the liberation of Paris important? Because number one, it's becoming very obvious that by August of 1944, the Nazis are on the run. They're not on the attack like they were 4 years earlier. Now they are on the defense, and they are being pushed further and further out of France. They're being now pushed across the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and they're slowly being pushed back to Germany itself. And this is, again, primarily coming from the Americans and the Brits. And we have to also give a shout out to our neighbors to the north, the Canadians. But at the same time, you've got the Soviets. Again, I know the narrator had mentioned the Russians. Remember, there is no Russia in 1944. Russia was one of the republics of the Soviet Union. So they're coming from the east as a result of the turning point battle of the Eastern Front. That's Stalingrad. You've got the turning point battle on the Western Front. That's, of course, Normandy D-Day. And so the Nazis are now being squeezed on 2 different sides. So that leads me to number 2. So by the time you get to August, September, October of 1944, the feelings with especially the Americans is that it's not just a matter of if, it's a matter of when Nazi Germany would unconditionally surrender, that victory was within the grasp of the Allied forces. However, the sad reality is Adolf Hitler has one more trick, if you will, up his sleeve, as you're going to find out. So I'd like everybody to skip a full page. I'd like you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make certain again that you date your notes again for today. It is February 18th, 2022. And now we're going to talk about one of the biggest overall battles of World War II. D-Day is generally the invasion of Normandy is the one that gets a lot of, gets a big focus. There's been movies made about it. But again, when you really want to look at a significant battle, you should also be looking at the Battle of the Bulge. All right, so let me give you a little background information on the Battle of the Bulge. So now we're going to fast forward several months. It is now December, and the year is 1944. So by December of 1944, the Allies at this point are kind of laying low because the bad weather has crept in from the winter time, figuring it was only a matter of time before the Nazis would unconditionally surrender. And besides, with the weather being so lousy, everybody amongst the Allies, especially the Americans, are thinking they can just hunker down and the fighting will cease until the weather starts to clear up. Well, sadly, Adolf Hitler has one more little trick up his sleeve. No, it's not a little trick, it's a big one. And so in December of 1944, the Germans are going to launch their last major offensive of World War II. In Hitler's mind, this is it. If the Nazis can succeed in this offensive, they could basically create or drive a wedge, if you will, between the Americans and the Brits and start to force them back again. If the Nazis don't succeed with this offensive, then basically it's just a matter of time before they would be forced to surrender. So this is critical in Hitler's perspective. So the name of this offensive is, we call this the Battle of the Bulge. And I'll explain to you later on why we call it the Battle of the Bulge. So the Battle of the Bulge starts on December 16th, 1944. So this again is months after the D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. And it wraps up a little over a month later. By about the 27th of January of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge will have ended. So the Battle of the Bulge, and again, it's really important to always incorporate geography when you're teaching history, especially World War II. So this map really does a nice job of illustrating the Battle of the Bulge. So here's Germany over here. See when I'm circling my cursor? This is Belgium. These are what we call the Ardennes right here. Here is one of the Low Countries down here. That's Luxembourg. Belgium right here. France is over here. And all these, see all these red lines? This represents the Nazis going on the attack, and they're trying to catch, especially the Americans, off guard. All right, so what's Germany's goal? It's real simple. So what the Germans are going to try to do in December of 1944 is this is their last major offensive, and they're specifically going after the Americans who had been stationed in what's called the Ardennes Force, which is in Belgium. Now, again, a couple of things to keep in mind about the Ardennes, and I would make a little oral note off to the side. Number one, the Ardennes were considered almost impenetrable. The idea of bringing in a large army and tanks and motorized vehicles through there was considered absolutely something that was not capable of being done. And number two, the weather by this point had really taken a nasty turn. It was considered to be at that point one of the coldest winters in recorded record, or on recorded record, I should say, if you're studying the history of meteorology in Belgium. So again, these are what we call the Ardennes right here. And again, here's Germany right here, France down over here, Luxembourg over here, one of your low countries, but primarily this historic battle will be taking place in Belgium, and it's going to be the Americans who are going to receive the brunt of it. All right. If you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, and I would definitely make an oral note off to the side, take a good look at this photograph. The weather was horrific for the Battle of the Bulge. Again, the snow, the cold, That's why, again, everybody was thinking at this point, especially the Americans are thinking there's no way there's going to be any fighting for a couple months till this weather starts to clear up. But when you're dealing with a desperate enemy in Nazi Germany, they're willing to take chances. Oh, and by the way, I would make another little side note that a lot of these American soldiers that were stationed, again, in the Ardennes, I should say, where the Nazis had launched this full-scale invasion on the 16th of December, 1944, a lot of them were 18, 19-year-old kids. They were greenhorns. They were rookies. They had not seen major combat. And so the thought process was to put these rookies over here because they figured it would be a while before they would see major combat. Well, they're going to get their baptism in fire, as they like to say, figuratively speaking. So if you direct your attention back up to my, again, laptop screen, this again is, a nice map giving you an overview of the battle itself. And one of the big places we're going to target is right here. It's called Malmedy, and we're going to talk about that right now. So it's one day later. It's December 17th, 1944. So the Nazis have stormed into the Ardennes, and they've specifically hit this one Belgian village called Malmedy. And on the 17th of December, 1944, one of the worst massacres in American history, especially when you're talking about World War II, is going to transpire. So again, if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is again a map of, again, we're talking about the Battle of the Bulge. And it's going to be, again, Malmedy, where you're going to witness this horrific massacre is going to transpire. So if you would please direct your attention back up to my laptop screen. So this is a photograph that was taken after the Malmedy massacre. So what had happened was a group of American soldiers had basically surrendered to the Nazis. They were caught off guard, and they were now considered to be POWs, prisoners of war. And what the Nazis proceeded to do was to line up these American prisoners of war, and they just began to execute them with machine guns. Any American soldier that, again, somehow survived this onslaught, who tried to feign that they had been killed, the Nazis would actually walk by them and shoot them in the head. So when all is said and done, it's been estimated that anywhere from 300 to 375 American soldiers were brutally executed as prisoners of war by the Nazis. At the same time, we estimate over 100 Belgian civilians who tried to come to the aid of these American soldiers, they also were executed by the Nazis. Just a brutal, horrific event when you study World War II. So now we're going to fast forward several days, 4 days to be in particular. It's now December 21st, and it's 1944. So you're a couple of days away from Christmas. And trust me, nobody's going to be doing any celebrating. There's going to be no holiday festivities at this point. Now everybody's gone into survival mode. So again, now what the Nazis have done is not only have they gone after Malmedy, but now they're going to target another Belgian town, and it's pronounced Bastogne. And so if you direct your attention again up to my laptop screen, this is again a map of, again, Belgium. And then here is Bastogne, which is located way down over here. That's our next big target we're going to focus on with the Battle of the Bulge. So what's going to happen is this guy right here, Anthony McAuliffe. He is the main American commander that has been completely surrounded by the Nazis at Bastogne. And the story is the Nazis have sent him basically communication and basically said, either you unconditionally surrender or we're going to slaughter everybody, every American in this particular village of Bastogne. And so Anthony McAuliffe was trying to think of the right response to the Nazis. And this is considered to be the only funny thing. There's nothing funny about World War II, and there's certainly nothing funny about the Battle of the Bulge. But Anthony McAuliffe's response was actually kind of funny because his response was nuts, nuts. So nuts is kind of like a figure of speech. It was kind of slang, if you will. Like if today, if something doesn't go your way and you don't do well in assessment and you say, ah, shoot, or oh, crud, if you get my drift. And that's kind of what nuts meant. But see, the Nazis don't understand slang, so they didn't really understand what his response was. So yes, at this point, nuts was the comment and not from Mr. Peanuts. I digress. Let's continue on. So now, another reason why the early stages of the Battle of the Bulge were not going well for the Americans, because Hitler had been not only planning for this offensive, going back to the D-Day invasion way back in June of 1944. But for a period of time, Hitler had been overseeing this top secret operation, and it involved a new tactic. So this operation, and it's something that you won't read about in TCI. Again, I wouldn't expect you to see it in a regular 8th grade text, because it's up to the history instructor, the history teacher, to again fill in the blanks. So it was called Operation Grief. Okay. Operation Grief was this top secret project that Adolf Hitler had overseen. And basically what it was taking German soldiers who spoke English, but now training them to speak perfect English with no discernible accent whatsoever. And so what they would do is they would take uniforms from American prisoners of war, put these uniforms on these German soldiers, and these German soldiers would then infiltrate the American forces in Belgium, in, again, villages like Malmedy or Bastogne. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is the German commander that was in charge of, again, Operation Grief and sending out these German forces. His name was Otto Skorzeny. And so what was the purpose of Operation Grief? And I would draw a line off to the side. One word: sabotage. In other words, the role of these German soldiers who, again, spoke perfect English, but they were Nazis, okay, was to infiltrate into the American troops and try to do things like turn street signs around or kill unsuspecting American soldiers who thought they were talking to a fellow GI. So eventually, what's going to happen is the Americans begin to realize, wait a minute, we've got some figurative rats that have infiltrated our forces. So they realized that the Nazis have acted as imposters. They're impersonating American soldiers, and they're causing a lot of problems. So now the Americans have to figure out, well, how do you discern, how do you differentiate the Nazi imposter from the actual American soldier? So what the Americans did was they decided that two can play this game to be clever and deceitful. So now what the Americans did was whenever they would run into a soldier, they would just basically ask them a series of questions, because again, you weren't certain, again, when they were speaking, whether or not they were actually a Nazi imposter or an American soldier, because their English was so perfect. It was impeccable. However, the one thing Hitler didn't train this group of soldiers to speak in perfect, impeccable English was the fact that, again, they wouldn't know pop culture. So for example, what they would do is they would ask you a question. They would say, hey, soldier, who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? So you better know, hey, you better know it was Minnie Mouse, because if you don't answer the question correctly, I'll tell you in a second. Or they would say, soldier, they would say, hey, who won the World Series in baseball in 1944? Now, again, the Germans don't play baseball. They play football, which of course is soccer. So they would have no clue. So it turns out that the 1944 World Series was an all St. Louis World Series between the St. Louis Cardinals, the Cubs' arch nemesis, and the St. Louis Browns. And the Cardinals ended up defeating the Browns. So the question is, so what would happen if you didn't give the right answer? The answer is they would shoot you on the spot. They were not playing games. So eventually, Operation Grief was discovered, and the Americans figured out a way of rooting out the Nazi imposters. All right. So now we're going to fast forward to January of 1945. So again, the first couple of weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, or late December 1944 into early January of 45, it was not going well for the Americans. But because now we've discovered Operation Grief, we have figured out a way of rooting out the Nazi imposters. Again, Nazi soldiers trying to present themselves as American soldiers, posing as American soldiers. And remember how I talked about the weather, how lousy the weather was? That was actually an advantage that presented itself to the German forces. However, a couple of things start to change. Number one, so now we're getting into week 2 of January of 1945. And so the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, the weather was horrible. It was snowy, it was cold, it was foggy. And that was a huge advantage for the Germans when they brought their soldiers in and their tanks. And if you're an American GI and you would see through the mist, you know, is that an American? Is that a German? But see, now the weather starts to clear up. The snow is starting to ease up. The conditions are starting to clear up. It's not so cloudy. It's not so overcast. And the fog is lifting. And so now the American Air Force can actually see where the German, again, military has been moving and mobilizing. And they're now able to actually attack them in their stronghold in the Ardennes forest. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that, of course, is the American Air Force. And number two, the American GIs are just basically saying we've got to hold on just a little bit longer because help was on the way. And the help that was on the way was this gentleman, George S. Patton. I talked about Patton before. He was involved in North Africa. He was involved in the Italian campaign with regards to Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, working its way up the mainland of Italy. Patton also was in charge of Operation Fortitude. Remember that fake Phantom Army in Dover, England? He was the one general that the Nazis were concerned about because they thought he was crazy and he had this absolute insatiable desire to fight. So here comes Patton to the rescue. So those two things are really going to help those American soldiers who had been suffering for weeks, dealing with these harsh weather conditions and wondering, will help eventually come? Well, the answer is help is on its way. So I'd like everybody to skip a full page, and I'd like you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to watch back-to-back video clips on the Battle of the Bulge. Make certain again that you take your notes for today. It is February 18th, 2022. So I'm going to have you guys write down the series of some guide questions, two series of guide questions, back-to-back video clips on, I think, one of the biggest battles of World War II. I know D-Day gets a lot of the recognition, and rightfully so. It's the turning point, but don't underestimate the importance of the Battle of the Bulge. All right, so let me give you some guide questions. Number one, what problems did American GIs face during the Battle of the Bulge? So this video is going to tie together some of the loose ends of things that I've talked about earlier in my direct instruction. So I'm going to go through these guide questions relatively quickly. You'll have a chance to pause the Zoomcast to get caught up. Number two, what factor contributed to many of the American GIs? Remember, GI is an acronym. We learned about that in Notebook Guide number 35, government issue. What factor contributed to many American GIs' deaths during the Battle of the Bulge? Next guide question. What factors contributed to Germany's ultimate defeat during the Battle of the Bulge? All right. So we're going to begin the first of two video clips. This video is about 3 minutes long. Ladies and gentlemen, the History Channel doesn't get any better than that. The Battle of the Bulge.
During the Bulge, command broke down, supplies broke down, morale broke down, communications broke down, everything broke down. It was every man for himself. We were inadequately clothed. We didn't have rubber overshoes. We didn't have overcoats. We didn't have gloves. We didn't have scarves. My boots were so bad, I would strip newspapers and drapery off of the bombed out houses and wrap my feet in it. You were having trouble breathing because the snow was suffocating you. And consequently, we lost a lot of men who froze to death.
So here's what I would like everybody to do. You've got two choices. Do you want to start a new clean sheet of paper, which is fine, go to the right side, or would you prefer going to the back? I'll accept that too. So I'm going to give you another set of guide questions. It's a back-to-back job. I think the Battle of the Bulge is worth really devoting a little additional time on because I think it's a really significant battle when you're looking at the scope and sequence of World War II. Here we go. Number one. So I want you, based on this video clip, to describe in more detail the weather. I've talked a little bit about the weather. The video clip previously talked a little bit about the weather. No, weather plays a huge, huge, huge role in the Battle of the Bulge. Number two, stats, American casualties. Yes, as they mentioned in the previous video clip, it wasn't American, it was an Allied victory, but a very heavy cost was extracted. In addition, this film, this video clip you're going to watch was created by the United States Signal Corps and is footage that was captured from the German army. Now, here's my question. How was this an example of propaganda? We talked about propaganda going back to World War I. We talked about propaganda when we talked about the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and how they used propaganda in order to cultivate an image for themselves to promote their own cause, but at the same time try to impact adversely their enemy's cause, if you will. So how is this video clip an example of propaganda? All right, ladies and gentlemen, so here we go. Here's our second video clip, the Battle of the Bulge.
On December 16th, the triumphant cheers died down in Europe. In the Christmas season of 1944, nobody was predicting that the war would end by Saturday night or a week from Wednesday. And today, with the good news from all fronts singing on all radios, let us remember the dying days of 1944. The infantry remembers those days. They were not being reconverted for civilian production, nor were they worried then or ever that they would be left with too many shells or too many tanks. The army had come fast and far last fall. We had developed a certain tendency to become complacent. Complacency came to an end in time for the Christmas season. These men had never been complacent. As they fought, they did not seek employment in civilian industry that would secure them after the war. They did not complain about the scarcity of butter or roast beef or the high cost of living. The cost of living on the Cologne plain was considerably higher than in the United States, but they did not discuss it in their clubs. In December, we learned all over again the bitter lesson of war. War is conducted in mist and turmoil and uncertainty. Victory comes on no silver platters. The enemy sells nothing cheaply. The enemy is resourceful, desperate. The Nazi party is willing to sacrifice every building and every soul in Germany to stave off defeat. Reserves of men and materiel have been hoarded for the day of counterattack. Under cloudy skies and close-hanging ground mists that defied aerial observation, the very much alive German army gathered its forces in the Forest Isles to strike one strong, decisive blow at the American army. New and refitted divisions were brought up under cover of fog, darkness, and forest. The fury of robot and rocket weapons was unleashed against our front. In one day, the enemy smashed through the defenses of the American First Army on a 45-mile front and was biting deep into Luxembourg and Belgium. In 24 hours, the initiative changed hands, and the German army, which had put the word blitzkrieg into all languages, unleashed its desperate offensive. They had picked a time when the weather prevented us from using the air weapon, the weapon in which we decisively outweigh them. This film is being shown for the first time. It was captured from a German cameraman. He had taken it so that the German home front might gloat over the evidence of the success of Rundstedt's attack. In August, it was German convoys that were caught like this along the French roads. Now it was our convoys, ruined, burning where they'd been overrun. The sweat and iron of Detroit and Pittsburgh became the wreckage of Malmedy and Saint-Vite. We lost more than jeeps and half-tracks, tires and shells, tanks and guns. We lost men, 78,000 in dead, wounded, missing.
So again, some archival footage that was captured from the German army, giving you a better perspective. It's one thing when you read about Battle of the Bulge in a book, and when you get this kind of generic overview of it, but when you see this footage, and again, you hear those numbers, and again, you see the scenes of the weather, those first couple of weeks of the Battle of the Bulge was very, very trying indeed for the United States of America. Again, they were completely caught off guard. They did not think the Nazis had the military capability of launching this full-scale, all-out offensive into the Ardennes of Belgium, again, in middle December of 1944. All right, so here's what I need everybody to do. Please go back to the previous page of notes. And what I'd like to now do is I'd like to tie it all together in terms of summarizing the Battle of the Bulge. Again, when you talk about huge battles in Europe, in the European theater of the war, it don't get much bigger, I should say, than D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. So here we go. If you would please write this down. So the Battle of the Bulge, again, one of the truly significant battles of World War II, was important for three reasons. So again, you're looking at this map again of the Battle of the Bulge. Here's Germany over here. All these red arrows, this represents panzer units. Again, this was considered the elite of the Nazi forces in World War II. Again, here are the Ardennes right over here. There's Bastogne right there. There's Malmedy. We talked about that terrible massacre on, again, the 17th of December, 1944. France is over here. There's Verdun. We talked about that in World War I. All right, so number one. So why is it that we call it the Battle of the Bulge? Because, again, if you look at this map and you see how this blue line kind of bulges out a little bit. So what happens is the Nazis, again, force the Americans to fall back a little bit. So while the American forces bend, but they don't break. That's why we give this battle the nickname, the Battle of the Bulge. Think of it like a rubber band. I'm a very visual type of learner. And imagine with the rubber band being stretched and stretched and stretched, but it doesn't snap. And that's a great way of describing the American forces in the Ardennes for the Battle of the Bulge. Number two, but again, as that video pointed out, there was a very heavy price that was extracted from the United States of America. Again, remember I told you this earlier, they had moved a lot of their young rookie soldiers that had never seen any combat, 18, 19-year-old kids, into the Ardennes, thinking there's no way that the Nazis would ever launch a full-scale invasion. And boy, were they wrong. So you're looking at this battle that took place, again, transpired over a period of about maybe 5 to 6 weeks, a little over a month, between a month, month and a half, 75,000 American casualties, dead, wounded, missing in action, prisoners of war. Think again when I talked about the Malmedy massacre. Think about again about how those American soldiers had basically given themselves up right over here, and they were used as target practice by the Nazis. And any American that feigned that they were killed were instantly executed, shot in the head. Horrible. Number two, but the Germans also suffered a heavy price as well. Anywhere from 80 to 100,000 German soldiers dead, wounded, missing in action, prisoners of war. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to introduce something else to you, another topic that normally you don't study much when you study World War II. So this is going to take place a little under a month after the Battle of the Bulge, and it's called the Firebombing of Dresden. So when you talk about the Battle of the Bulge, okay, we go back to that. And the Battle of the Bulge is the last offensive of the Nazis. I told you this earlier. This was Hitler's last gasp. If he's successful with the Battle of the Bulge, he drives a wedge between the Americans and the Brits and buys the Nazis time. If he's unsuccessful, now it's only a matter of time before the Allies will prove to be victorious, because now they're going to be forcing the Germans back across the Rhine River into Germany. And one of the, I don't want to say topics, that's not the right term I'm thinking of, but one of the battles that's considered a controversial one when you study World War II is called the Firebombing of Dresden. So this is going to take place, again, a couple of weeks after the Battle of the Bulge. So over a couple of days, February 13th through the 15th, 1945, so over Valentine's Day. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is, of course, is a map of Germany right over here. And there is Berlin right here. There's your capital. And then down over here is Dresden. This is going to be the German city that is going to witness something that even today historians are going to have a discussion about or a debate about. And it's regarding the firebombing of Dresden. Was it necessary? Was it potentially a war crime? You tell me. So at this point, I'm going to stop my Zoomcast here, and I'm going to definitely go back to the firebombing of Dresden, because there actually is a connection with the firebombing of Dresden and then ultimately the end of World War II, when we talk about the atomic bomb that's going to be dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima or Hiroshima, and then several days later, Nagasaki. So at this point, what I'd like everybody to do is take out your correctable tape, and I want you to go and I want you to clean up anything that you crossed out or traced over in your ISN. Remember, this is a portfolio of your best effort. Then I want you to take your multiple colored highlighters, tip to tip. Remember, focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things. The highlighting is a strategy. It's a cognitive strategy. It's allowing you to develop a greater understanding and mastery of the information. When you're done highlighting, don't stop yet. You have to go back and review your ISN, the 10 to 15 minutes. You don't think twice about practicing for basketball or cricket or for soccer. So why aren't you practicing for school every day? It's the same thing. And if you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to your mom or dad. Do a Zoom session or a FaceTime session with a classmate, and you channel your inner Mr. Bonk, and you teach them the information we covered today. Talk about D-Day. Talk about, again, the whole point about whether or not the Allies would try to invade France through Calais, or at Calais, I should say, or another spot, which of course is Normandy. In addition, we talked about the outcome of D-Day invasion. Why was it the turning point of World War II? The fact that now it's the Allies, the Americans and the Brits and the Canadians and the Australians, now they're on the attack, they're on the offense, and it's now the Germans who are on the defense. And remember, 2 months after D-Day, Paris, France is liberated from Nazi control, going way back to June of 1940. And then you, of course, have the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies, the Americans are thinking there's no way the Nazis have the ability to launch a full-scale invasion at this point, especially into the impenetrable Ardennes in Belgium. The weather was lousy, and then the Nazis catch the Americans off guard temporarily. And what again was Operation Grief? How did Hitler try to deceive the Americans into thinking that these are just random acts of sabotage? And how did the Americans figure out who the Nazi imposters actually were? What role does the weather play at the Battle of the Bulge. It was huge. That was mentioned in both video clips, and I mentioned it as well. What about the role of George Patton? How does he make a difference in the Battle of the Bulge? And think about the importance of the battle. This is the last major offensive of the Nazis in the war, and now it's just a matter of time. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the Nazis will eventually fall, and Europe will have, again, the reign of terror of Adolf Hitler will be removed. But we'll save that for my next Zoomcast. So again, I hope everybody enjoyed today's Zoomcast as much as I enjoyed making it. And as I said, next time for my next Zoomcast, we're going to go back to the firebombing of Dresden. We're going to talk about the events eventually leading to one of the great dates in history, May 8th, 1945. That's VE Day, victory in Europe. But the war is still not over because we still have the fighting in, of course, the Pacific theater of the war against the Empire of Japan. But that is another story for another time. And as I always like to say, as I wrap up my Zoomcast, the story may have ended today, but the saga will continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.